Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for tuning in. In this panel, we're going to be talking about a game franchise that has had a pretty big impact on the overall video game landscape. From the very beginning, it was revolutionary, and it continues to raise the bar and set industry standards. Its titles are bestsellers and regularly appear on top game ranking lists. And the stories and experiences found within the games have touched so many people on a deeply profound level. I'm talking about, of course, The Legend of Zelda. And can you folks believe it's about to turn 35?
No, I don't. I hate it.
Does it make you feel old?
Well, my birthday is exactly 2 weeks before the original Legend of Zelda came out. So, anytime I see Zelda's turning 30, I'm going, oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, my name is Shona Johnson, and I'm joined by a distinguished panel of Zelda experts. We're here from ZeldaUniverse.net, which is one of the largest and longest running online Zelda communities. So panelists, please introduce yourselves and tell me how you became a Zelda fan and what your favorite Zelda game is.
Hi, my name's Alex Rosenberg. I am the media director at Zelda Universe, aka anything that you see on YouTube or Twitch or the podcast, yeah, that goes through this guy. That goes through me right here. Out of everybody here on this panel, I am probably the person that got into Zelda, the latest. My first Zelda experience was 2010. I was a freshman in high school, and I decided, I don't entirely know why, to start with the original Legend of Zelda. And the only reason why I know this was a couple years back, I was going on Facebook and somehow came across a status of me exclaiming how many times I died playing the original game. That interest got me into playing Ocarina of Time, which got me into A Link to the Past, and got me into all these other great Zelda games, which is also sort of how I got into connections with all of these lovely people, and it's probably the one franchise that has changed me the most as a gamer, which is a lot in a very small period of time, which is A+.
Well, I am Amanda VanHiel. I am one of the news editors, but mainly I do Zelda news, and I'm on the Twitch channel, and I'm on the podcast, and I do other panels. Basically anything that involves a person being on camera, talking about Zelda, or behind a mic, talking about Zelda is where you will find me. So my first Zelda game was this beautiful piece of art, Ocarina of Time. I was 12 when it came out, and so I saved my money, and my dad took me to KB stores, or KB Toy Store, to buy Ocarina of Time that I bought with my own money, which I was very proud of. And that is basically what made me a Zelda fan. I would be sitting in class reading this instead of stupid stuff they wanted me to read, which was really boring, and this was way better. In fact, looking at this, I found a bookmark from 7th grade of me reading this. Apparently I never finished the book. I don't like to read, so that explains
what
why
book
I never
was that?
finished it. This is the book version of Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Pathways to Adventure.
So it's a junior novel of the game.
It's a junior novel of Ocarina of Time that I didn't finish. Ocarina of Time, I felt honestly like it changed my life. I felt like I grew up as a gamer when I first played Ocarina of Time, despite being 12 and despite it being rated E for everyone. I still felt like I was playing a grown-up game. I had leveled up myself, and it's thanks to Zelda that I know all of these wonderful people, like Alex was saying. But my favorite Zelda game, while it was Ocarina of Time for the longest time, has changed to Breath of the Wild.
Yeah, my name's Cody. I have been a member of the Zelda Universe staff since 2007 when I became a forum moderator over on our forums, which is very old in forum terms. I made my account in 2003, which is older than I think some of the staff on this website, my account. So that's exciting to think about, isn't it? But I've just been into Zelda for a long time now. I also started with Ocarina of Time, and then I went back and played some of the others, and my favourites probably Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Breath of the Wild.
I'm David. I am the publications editor of Zelda Universe, so everything that hits the front page of Zelda Universe usually goes not through me, but I kind of organize the teams behind that these days. I first got into Zelda with A Link to the Past, this beautiful Super Nintendo game. I kind of just fell in love with it instantly, immediately started consuming every and all Zelda content I could find, which was Link's Awakening and the CDI games. Yes, I actually didn't know that they were bad until a long time later when I found it on the internet of how bad these games were, but I loved them as a child. So then it got me into websites. Around 2000 is when I first started doing websites, and then I joined into Zelda Universe many years later. Breath of the Wild's my favorite game, but Link to the Past is always very near and dear to my heart.
Hi, I'm Kalum Buckland. I have been in the industry for quite a few years, but this is my first time on Zelda Universe, so thank you very much, guys, for having me. I do very little work for Zelda Universe, but I really appreciate the invite to be a part of today. Unlike Alex, I didn't discover the legend. I was born into it. I've been here since day one. Got the NES for Easter holidays. My mum brought it home one day and played Super Mario Brothers for a few weeks, and then went to the local store. And I don't know if it was by design, but they had this golden cartridge just at the top of the shelf, right at the back. All the other games were on the floor, and as soon as I saw this cartridge, something just sung out to me. The font, the gold cartridge, the design, I just knew that a legend was in the making just by looking at this game. So I don't know how it worked. Zelda in Australia especially was hard to come by, very, very difficult to buy. So it was just one of those games that was always passed around school. I never bought this game straight away. It was always a part of my collection because I borrowed it off people and lent it to people, and eventually got my own copy later on down the track. But this was a huge part of a lot of people's history without ever paying money for it. So I don't know how that worked, but yeah, that game's seen a lot of history. I've lent it to a lot of people, and it's come back to me a lot of times over the years. So a lot of fun to be had from that perspective. Also, probably the most important game from my perspective was this little puppy here, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I got my Super Nintendo. I hired this from the local Blockbuster back in the day, and it was about 11 o'clock at night. Pressed play, and it was raining outside and raining inside the game, and it just instantly took me to another world, and I got exactly what Zelda was all about. It was not just a game, it's taking you on an adventure. And that day I realised this isn't a game to rent for the weekend, this is a game to own. So I already did a paper round, but I actually then did 2 paper rounds every morning so I could afford money to buy that game, and that's what got me into collecting. So thank you, Zelda. I've spent a few $1,000s over the years, but really appreciate all of that, all of the special memories that Zelda's helped me create. I was a Zelda timeline theorist before the internet existed, reading the books when I got home and reading the manuals. There's so much history and lore in those manuals, and just randomly I feel like reading the books and going through the history of Zelda and putting together in my own head where they all fitted into the timeline. And then later on I found out that was quite a thing on the internet, and really enjoyed reading everyone else's theories. And my favourite Zelda game goes without saying. It's just, there's no denying it. This is the greatest game ever created. As much as I love all the other ones, and I usually wait a few years before you put the pinnacle of greatest game of all time, but from my perspective, this is the greatest game of all time. The experience that was shared around the internet and through friends and everyone playing this for the first time, I don't think will ever be replicated. There'll always be new styles of games coming out, but they did such an amazing job with the Breath of the Wild. And even during lockdown, you're not allowed to leave the house. Of sitting by my fireplace with the weather rolling over, Nintendo did such an amazing job. It's not, I don't have fun adventuring in this game. I have fun being part of the world. So yeah, thank you very much, Nintendo. Great job.
Kalum, I also got into Zelda through the original game. Mine was also a borrowed copy from my auntie. And yeah, the gold cartridge, the instruction manual, the story, it just hooked me from the very beginning. So I played that game over and over and over. And then I saw ads for Ocarina of Time, and so I also saved up all my money to buy the game. And it blew me away. And this is what took me from someone who loved Zelda into an obsessed Zelda fan who runs a Zelda website. However, and so Ocarina of Time was my favorite game for a long time, but like several of you, Breath of the Wild, it just raised the bar once again. And so now that is definitely my favorite Zelda game too. So we have got a lot of ground to cover today with 35 years of history. Alex, I
Yeah.
believe that you have some stats about the franchise for us.
Yeah, before we get too deep, let's run into some major stats because, yeah, 35 years means a lot of stuff. In the last 35 years, as of this week, this day of recording, August 16th, 2020, Zelda as a franchise has released 19 main games, 9 spin-offs, 9 remakes, and 32 total ports onto newer hardware. If you combine all the total sales of every Zelda game at this point, you're going to hit around 107 million units, putting Zelda at one of the top 25 of the best-selling game franchises of all time. And of course, we, along with everybody else on the internet, has been waiting with bated breath over information about the sequel to Breath of the Wild, which we will talk a little bit about later on and tell you how much we hope it's good. I really want it to be good. Although, here's the thing. We, as Zelda fans, are incredibly spoiled. Because, like, we'll talk about games about, oh, this game is the worst Zelda game of all time, and blah, blah, blah. Like, y'all, most Zelda games are, like, some of the best games anyway. Most Zelda games don't get anything under a 7. Let's be clear. Every Zelda game in the franchise is a good game.
Right, and not only that, but also we get them released regularly. We do have one Metroid fan on staff who is long-suffering because they released Metroid Other M for the Wii and then just did nothing for about 8 years. And whereas we get every year we've got something.
So the first Zelda game was released in February 1986, but it began development a couple of years earlier in 1984. But the idea sprung even before that, and does anyone know where it actually came from?
Well, didn't it come from Miyamoto, like, exploring in the forest and coming up with his own, like, little adventures?
Yep. So basically he wanted to recreate his childhood experiences exploring the landscapes around his hometown of Kyoto in Japan. Zelda One was a huge success. It was the first NES game to sell 1 million copies, and it also set the standard by being the first cartridge-based game to allow you to save your progress thanks to an internal battery. So before that, you often had to use passwords or just play the game all in one sitting, but Zelda, because it was so big, it allowed you to save. So I'd like to ask the panel, Zelda 1, does it still hold up today?
I mean, I think it does. I think it's still a good game. It's very important in gaming history because it gave us so many different things. But honestly, the 8-bit era and the 16-bit era both hold up really well just because of the art styles, and it's something that can still be enjoyed today. So, I mean, I think it's a good game. I would play it. I'm not good at it, but it is still a good game. It's still a fun adventure.
I'm gonna make the case that 16-bit I think ages a little bit better than 8-bit.
Well, it does. I'm just saying that both do age. Yeah. Have aged well.
Yeah.
In comparison to like the N64.
No, absolutely. At least in terms of graphical stuff. I think the one thing that I'm hesitant about, like, Zelda 1 is a game with monumental impact, and it is a legendary game. However, in looking at it in a 2020 lens, it is very vague. Like, you get dropped in and you're just running around. There's nothing very explicit of, hey, here's a secret that you can do. Hey, did you know you could bomb random walls in a map? In a landscape now, I feel like it's probably harder for people to get into that game without any sort of a guide, because the games have shifted in that sort of way. So I feel like it's probably more polarizing to go from something like Breath of the Wild, or say something like Minish Cap or Twilight Princess, to something like this if they hadn't played it before, because of how drastically different it is.
Right, and I mean, well, Breath of the Wild, which we'll come to obviously later, did to an extent cut back on the amount of exposition and support characters saying, hey, your batteries are low, etc. It's in a modern era where if you don't know something, you can look it up. And I think the thing about the original Zelda games also is just the culture in which it was, is if you knew something, you knew it either because you heard a rumor at school or because it was in the Nintendo magazine that you bought, and then that led to a whole lot of rumors around the place, like that, when I was 8, the big conspiracy theory was that there was a Mew under the truck in Pokemon Red and Blue. That was all, and that seemed to be international somehow, even though it was spread entirely by school rumor. And I think that's something really interesting about the older games, is the sort of sense of, like, group learning that you can do, where you show up to school and you're like, I don't know what to do here, and then people offer their suggestions and that sort of thing. Like, personally, for me, the original Legend of Zelda, it's not a big replay game for me, because I started with Ocarina of Time, and then Legend of Zelda I went back to and I liked it, but it didn't have that big impact for me because I'd already experienced Zelda. Like, the big impact for me was Ocarina of Time, so that's the one I tend to replay more.
Going back to the beginning, what Miyamoto and the Zelda team were able to achieve in this, and I think it's really important being at the start of the history, is to really realise they weren't setting out to make a game. They were setting out to capture the spirit of adventure, and that's exactly what this game has done. And it's actually continued over the next 35 years into every single game, and everyone's got a different entry point, but being there at the beginning, and as you were alluding to, this thing spread like wildfire. We're talking at school about, I've burnt this bush, you can get to level 8, and then level 8, how do you get to there? And it was all just a shared spirit of adventure, which is very hard to replicate in this with the internet, etc. But it's something that I think is really important. Nintendo were very good at doing that, and it's like, we're not here to make a game with dungeons or bushes you can burn. We're here to capture that spirit of adventure, and I think they absolutely nailed it. And if you do have the patience to go back and try it again, just start from scratch and walk out into that cave, get your sword and set off an adventure, that's exactly what the game still captures today, which is quite special.
Yeah, and Zelda 1 was codenamed Adventure while it was in development. So, a sequel to Zelda 1 was released the following year. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is widely considered to be the black sheep of the Zelda franchise. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes. I think it's one of those where, I was going to say, the first game is harsh. It's fair, but harsh. It is one of those where it's a good game, but I don't know if I'd recommend it to people today as, here's how to start playing The Legend of Zelda. Adventure of Link is, I think, even more harsh, and the penalty for failure is, I think, even a lot worse, because you get 3 lives, and you're back to the beginning of the entire map. Keep your progress. But it is very, very hard, and it's, at that point it was side-scrolling, which is very odd. It has an overworld, which is, different overworld, where it's like, icons on a map. So it feels different than everything else, but at that point in time, Zelda hadn't been locked down, so they were still trying to figure out, what is this Zelda? What is the spirit of adventure? And side-scrolling made sense at the time.
And it did lead to some innovations that we still use today, like having a third piece of the Triforce, which seems natural to us now because it's a Triforce. There should be 3 of them, but there are only 2 in the original Legend of Zelda, which is reflected in the original cartoon, I believe, as well.
While we're talking about the early days of the franchise, we also had 2 other Zelda games released on the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy, and I believe that both of those also pushed gaming ahead. Like, they really maximized what you could do with the hardware at the time. And then Nintendo culture was so big in the late 80s and early 90s that we did have all of this merchandise and comic books and choose your own adventure books and the animated series. So did anyone watch the animated series back in the day?
I have it, but I had watched it before I got it on DVD. I love it. It's terrible, but I love it.
It's got the sound effects, it's got the dungeons, it's got the underworld, it's got the overworld. It's brilliant.
Cody a couple years ago sent me the DVD, and I watched it all last year because we covered it on an episode of the Zelda Universe podcast. And it is so late 80s, early 90s cheese in a way that I can't really defend it, because it is just so uncanny valley 90s and 80s.
Yep, I watched it in the 90s because it did air here in Australia, and at the time I was just like, this is so cool, it's Zelda on TV, but then that's not how I imagined Link whatsoever. But it didn't seem that different from other cartoons that were on around that time as well.
It was very much just a product of its time.
Oh, it absolutely is, which is also why I can't defend it.
Hey, excuse me, princess.
The next major milestone for the Zelda franchise was its jump to 3D on the Nintendo 64. Now, transitioning from 2D to 3D brings a lot of challenges for games, and not all franchises did it very well. Ocarina of Time, however, went on to once again set the standard for 3D gaming with its revolutionary Z targeting system. So how do you guys think the 2D Zeldas compare to the 3D Zeldas?
I think A Link to the Past is the best version of it. Of 2D.
I do feel like A Link to the Past built on Zelda 1, and then Ocarina of Time built on A Link to the Past, for sure.
Yeah.
And the transition from Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time, Nintendo captured that fairy in a bottle with A Link to the Past, and to be able to translate it into 3D so perfectly, and they did it so well that it took a lot of us back then a while to realise that this was just A Link to the Past, but in 3D. It was such a new experience, and so which is what Nintendo are going for, and then stepping back, it was like, that's basically A Link to the Past, but in 3D, so to capture that fairy in a bottle twice, I think they're both at the exact, absolute elite top tier of 2D and 3D at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, in my ranking of favourite Zelda games, that's something different to my ranking of most important Zelda games, and I think both A Link to the Past, I think the original Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and then Breath of the Wild are sort of what I would put in the video game Hall of Fame as important milestones in video games.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that.
In terms of the actual play style of it, like, for me, A Link Between Worlds I liked more than A Link to the Past, you know, just because I felt like, oh, here's all this cool modern stuff, you know. But that doesn't mean A Link to the Past wasn't as important. It's just like, that's a really steady template to build from.
Yeah, and it used to be very easy until Breath of the Wild came out, because you had the Triforce, you had the original, you had Link to the Past, and then you had Ocarina of Time. Now there's a fourth one? Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
the
well, that's
Tetraforce, which you can get if you beat the Postman in a race in Ocarina of Time. At least that's what.
That's it.
that tracks.
Now, yeah, Ocarina of Time was really held up as, you know, the pinnacle of not just Zelda gaming, but one of the best games of all time. And it actually won a Guinness World Record and still holds it today for most critically acclaimed game. Now, for many years, the Zelda community always held up Ocarina of Time. And then after a few years, people started to say, maybe the game's a bit overrated. Would you guys agree or disagree with that?
Disagree.
I disagree, absolutely disagree.
I think that depends in context of, do I still think it's a 9 out of 10 or whatever? Yes. Like, do I think that it's at the pinnacle of Zelda games? No. Like, for me, I think later games that built on the formula, like Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, did do a lot of what Ocarina of Time did, but then added more and more cool stuff to it. So in that sense, like, in Zelda community terms, I might call it overrated in the sense that, like, if we did a poll on Facebook or something, Ocarina of Time would do really well, but it wouldn't necessarily line up with my list. But I still think it is as important as people say it was.
Ocarina of Time was just highly influential, not just to Zelda, but in gaming in general, especially in games of that era. I mean, of the games that came out around the same time, within like 2-3 years of Ocarina of Time, the big ones that have changed how we see video games and have kind of established a formula for future installments were Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, GoldenEye, and Final Fantasy VII. Those were the four that really changed the direction of gaming.
Yep.
So I cannot call it overrated for that reason, but at the same time, it's like the games that came afterwards built upon what Ocarina of Time created. So if you're used to Breath of the Wild and like Wind Waker and you're used to the really bright, shiny stuff, and you go back and play Ocarina of Time on the N64, you're not gonna like it. But so it's more of a perspective there.
Yep, and Ocarina of Time also had a 3D remake on the 3DS, so I think that gave it that shiny upgrade, that polish, which, you know, yes, the Nintendo 64 graphics started to look really out of date, but I think that gave it that modern look, and that game also received really high scores when it was released.
I will go on record and say that Ocarina of Time 3D is the definitive way to play Ocarina of Time in a modern day, and if there are people who are watching this that have never played a Zelda game, Ocarina of Time 3D is honestly the one place I recommend anyone start. It is the game that solidified Zelda in 3D. It is the game that really establishes what it is, and it is honestly one of the best examples of what Zelda is as a franchise.
Do you think Ocarina of Time should have an HD remake?
Yes!
Yes.
No question!
The fact the definitive way to play it is on a handheld, as much as I love that, you need a way to play that on the big screen, really experience
Right.
it.
And I think
It will come one day.
everything should be on Switch.
Yeah, I
for
can't
one
play
thing.
handhelds much anymore because it gives me migraines, so I would love for it to be on a bigger screen so I can play it for more than 30 minutes.
Ocarina deserves it, no question.
And it would introduce it to a new audience, which is really important.
The Nintendo 64, I think the part that absolutely holds up the least is the graphics of both the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 1. Like Final Fantasy VII, the other one mentioned, the main character is made up of like 3 Lego blocks.
Hey. 4.
4 Lego
Four
blocks.
Lego blocks.
You go back and look at it and you're like, this isn't quite what I remember. But Ocarina of Time 3D is what you remember Ocarina of Time on the N64
Yes.
looking like, you know?
Ocarina of Time also had a direct sequel on the Nintendo 64, Majora's Mask. And let's give Majora's Mask a little bit of love right now because it turns 20 this year.
This is the fun lenticular thing.
So Majora's Mask used a lot of the same assets as Ocarina of Time. But at the same time, it turned out to be a very different game from what a lot of people were expecting. So what were your impressions of Majora's Mask?
Well, Majora's Mask was developed within a 2-year period. Like, they were given literally 2 years. One. It was given, like, an incredibly short turnaround, so, like, all the asset flips had to happen. Honestly, my opinions of Majora's Mask have probably been the one thing that have changed the most throughout my entire existence as a Zelda fan, because I used to think of it in really high regard, and now I'm not so sure.
I actually think Majora's Mask does something for the Zelda franchise that really hadn't been replicated until Breath of the Wild. Ocarina of Time is a game with breadth. That, you know, you've got a lot of different varieties of scenery, there's a lot of characters. Majora's Mask is a story about depth. You actually feel, Clocktown is the first time I ever felt like this is a real video game town. I just don't talk to the same person over and over and they repeat the same line to me every single time. I come back at a different time and I get a different set of dialogue. And now every character feels unique, and I think that's its selling point, is that because of the Groundhog Day cycle of 3 days, you actually get to experience, and especially tragedy, you get to experience the as, you know, we pitch towards the moon falling, and that is fascinating.
It's a beautiful story. I need to just write a whole thing on it. It's Majora's Mask and Love Actually are the exact same formula. Think about it. It follows the exact same formula.
Oh my god.
Because they follow the same formula.
Oh my
because
god.
They're both a story about love, whether it is platonic love, romantic love, just respect for one another. That's what they're both about. It hit me one day when I was watching it, and I was like, because like a bunch of friends of mine wanted to watch it, and I was like, this is Majora's Mask.
Oh my
Majora's
god.
Mask. This is amazing.
Thanks, son. I have to go and watch Love Actually again. Yep.
And then put
Just
Majora's
pay
Mask right
attention
after.
to because of the ensemble characteristics to it, and because it starts off where they're talking about, like, when you meet people at an airport, you know, everybody's loving each other and they're all hugging each other, and it was all about, like, 9/11 calling people on the planes. Those weren't calls of hatred, they were all calls of I love you, and that's what was happening with Majora's Mask. They were showing each other how much they care about each other right before the moon fell.
That's so true. That, was absolutely heartbreaking.
The thing I love the most about Majora's Mask, just quickly, is how brave Nintendo were to basically follow on Ocarina of Time by taking away Epona, taking away the Ocarina, taking away you being Link and putting you in the body of a Deku, and then putting you into this world where you couldn't save. It was a suspend save. That took us back then a long time to figure out and try and figure, what does it mean if I save, then when I come back I'll lose everything? And that was very brave of Nintendo, and it made that game so much more intrinsically you're connected to it. You're invested into it, and you really had to figure it out and become part of that world. So for that, I really applaud them, and it's still a wonder to play it today.
And the pressure of the 3-day cycle as well. I think a lot of players either loved that or hated that.
Yeah, it was bold to do that, because to make a sequel for such an acclaimed game and to do it so differently, that took guts.
Oh yeah.
So after Zelda's huge success on the Nintendo 64, expectations were really, really high for the next installment on Nintendo's newest console, the GameCube. So when Nintendo unveiled its first look at the Wind Waker in 2001, it turned out to be one of the more controversial moments in the series' history. Alex, did you have something about that?
Yeah, so really interesting, and this is where things get a little bit fun. Nintendo does this thing at Space World 2000, where they are talking about the GameCube hardware, and they show a bunch of tech demos to sort of say, hey, look, this is what the GameCube can do. And one of those demos was a very realistic looking boss battle of Link and Ganon just going at it with some swords.
And that blew us away back in the day.
It blew
Absolutely
everybody's mind. And everyone was like, oh my god, this is the new Zelda game. What? It's so cool. And then the next year, Nintendo was like, so how about cartoons and boats? How do you feel about cartoons and boats? Because guess what? You're getting it anyway. And everyone was like, why? It made a lot of people mad.
In my experience, that was the first time the internet got broken in half. Like it, you know, I wasn't on the internet a lot, but that just split the entire internet.
There were many more times, but that was
Dave,
the first.
you were in the community then. Do you remember how much it blew up?
I remember, because I was actually co-webmastering my website, The Grand Adventures, with someone who is called Pigeon5. And I remember talking to him, and I'm just seeing everyone blow up, and there were people who were trashing it and people who were defending it. And I remember asking, what take should we have? And knowing that I'm just like, this is not what I asked for. And we made the political call to defend it because it's Zelda. We still have to, like, it's still what it is. But I remember just like, oh my god, it was just like Link looked like Arnold, just like this big oval head, and I couldn't not see it.
It was the first time that Nintendo came out and Miyamoto came out and publicly apologized for a decision they made, or not apologise, but tried to put it in perspective. And they had to give this away for free to get people to pre-order it. No one wanted to.
That is true. That is how we got this.
Yeah, that's the whole reason we got Masterclass. So thank you, Internet.
But also, when you look at it, Wind Waker's graphics have probably aged better than literally any other 3D Zelda game out there, because that cel-shaded graphics does hold up incredibly well, and you can specifically see that with the HD remake on Wii U.
Well, I was actually surprised when they announced the HD remake. I thought, well, out of all the Zelda games, that probably least needs a remake right now.
But it actually added a lot of really great things to it.
It did.
Sadly, it lost some of the tingle functionality, but it added different tingle functionality.
But we got selfies out of it, so like, I'm game.
Yeah, no, that's important.
Yep, and the original Wind Waker did have a few issues that a lot of gamers complained about. The difficulty, it was very, very easy. The sailing was boring, and some of the pacing towards the end of the game, such as the Triforce Hunt, was also too slow.
I'm glad they improved on the Triforce Hunt, because, oh my god.
Yeah, I remember Triforce Hunt on GameCube being, like, genuinely the worst, and now it's not that bad because of Wii U. But, again, the HD remakes are the definitive way to play a lot of those games. So, like, if you have, like, a Wii U and there is an HD version, that is the version you should be playing.
Now, let's contrast the Wind Waker with Twilight Princess, which was also in development for the GameCube, although because it was delayed, it ended up being a launch title for the Wii. It was the biggest selling Zelda game of all time up until Breath of the Wild.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, it makes sense because the Wii was Nintendo's best-selling console of all time, and then Twilight Princess was a launch game.
It does a lot of major changes because it goes fully in reverse. And it goes closer to that Space World kind of thing. I remember watching the trailers of that and watching people lose their goddamn minds when that trailer shows up.
Mm-hmm.
E3 2004.
The music still takes me back there.
I know. Yeah. That music from Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah, which they've
Actually.
used before. They used it for the Ocarina. They used it for Majora.
For a commercial.
Like a lot, but my God, with Twilight Princess, I think that's where it's been. That's where that music I think has more relevance to me.
So one thing that we should talk about while we're discussing Twilight Princess is Link's companions, because that was something that was introduced in Ocarina of Time with Navi. However, she was a little bit controversial and not everyone was a big fan. Now, Twilight Princess had Midna, and many Zelda gamers would say Midna is probably the best of all of Link's companions. Would you agree?
I agree.
I love Midna. She's pretty great. But I do like Navi. I like Navi.
Midna has that level of snark and genuine sincerity that I really, really like.
She has an arc.
She also has the most compelling arc out of everybody. In
And
side
generally
characters.
makes the ending heartbreaking, not to spoil anything, but there's a real tug of the heartstrings
Right.
at the end there.
Well, that's the thing is, she gets more development than most side characters because the game is about her. Like, Link is the protagonist of Twilight Princess, but is not the main character, I guess. Like, it's a story about Midna in a way that, it's not the case for a lot of other games. They're side characters or they're important to the plot, but it's not their story. Whereas Twilight Princess really went all in on Link. That's just some guy who's along for the ride, but Midna, that's who this is about.
And I think it's those segments that I think are probably the tightest paced in the game because Twilight Princess suffers from a bit of padding in a lot of ways. Like the opening hours are particularly rough because the game decides, hey, let's make you herd goats twice in the span of a 90-minute period.
I like the goat herding.
Yeah, but did we really need to do it twice?
Yes.
It's
Well, I
feeding the
remember-
cat at the pier that got me. Like, I was catching the fish and it wouldn't quite connect to the hitbox.
Yeah.
I was there for 3
That fish
hours.
That happened to me.
So, Twilight Princess, I feel like the elephant in the room here is that a lot of people have problems with Twilight Princess because they feel like it started to get a bit too generic as a franchise. Like, previously there had been interesting innovations along the way, and Twilight Princess had some innovations, but it did feel the most out of any game so far, like they were trying to recreate Ocarina of Time and the magic of it.
Yeah. Agreed.
Like, I remember when Ocarina of Time, they had this selling point of it's going to take 24 hours to cross Hyrule Field. And of course, most of us at that time misunderstood, like, it's 24 real clock hours. But, it's just the day-night cycle. But, like, Twilight Princess, Hyrule Field, if you are on, like, if you're walking around, it takes 15 real-time minutes to do that. And there's not much there. It's actually a very boring area, but it still takes time to just do that. And that's the padding issue. It's the pacing of the game was just all wrong because they just elongated it to kind of try to make this bigger story, which didn't really feel bigger.
The 2000s were a great time to be a Zelda fan, which two major releases, Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, but there were also a slew of handheld games released at that time. We had the Oracle games, the Minish Cap, Spirit Tracks, Phantom Hourglass, and also Four Swords Adventures on the GameCube. So I think there was a game coming out practically every single year of that decade.
Golden days. And to get 2 Zelda games on the same day, and everyone thinks this is like Pokemon Red and Blue. These are entirely different games, built with the same assets, but totally different adventures that link together. Wow, what days to actually have 2 games like that come out on the same day? Brilliant. I'm not going to get it
It's
again.
important to note that those were by Capcom. Capcom developed. This was the first
Correct.
time since the dark days of CDI that Nintendo licensed Zelda to someone else. And are they the best Zelda games? No. I mean, they're good. But it's important to note that they were actually fairly successful for what they were. And this actually begins the era that Nintendo is trusting other developers to actually use their IP again for, the betterment of the franchise.
Well, they did so well, they invited them to come back again and do Minish Cap. If you're given Zelda and you do that, says a lot about the quality of Seasons and Ages.
I feel like in terms of just developing, new games, new spin-offs, that kind of thing, they've only very recently sort of, like, finally said, alright, let's let you make Hyrule Warriors and let's let you make, all these fun, really odd ideas, like the Crypt of the Necrodancer spin-off.
Which I absolutely adore.
And I love it, but I think it's just something that, like, I think they got burned on, like, the live-action Super Mario Brothers movie 30 years ago, and then ever since they just didn't trust anybody.
Well, now they're doing it again, so I was actually going to bring up the fact that, like, Capcom made 3 Zelda games that were very solid. And I think, like, Minish Cap introduced some really great writing, introduced probably one of the most fabulous-looking villains in the franchise, up until, like, Skyward Sword.
We found out how Link got his hat. That was big back in the time.
Yeah, they crafted this whole story arc around Slow, which I think was really compelling.
Yeah, I feel like Capcom were a lot more brave. Like, they had success with the Oracle games, which felt quite similar to past games like Link's Awakening and Zelda One. So with Minish Cap, they were really like, right, we know what we're doing now, Nintendo trusts us, and they really took that step forward and sort of created something that was more their own.
And being an Aussie, there was a kangaroo in one of these. Can't remember. Sorry, I think it was.
Both of them.
Very happy. Yep.
Oracle, Aussie seal of approval.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been a boomerang in Zelda games since the very
Of
start.
course. Yeah.
I mean, that's fair.
So I'd now like to jump ahead to the 25th anniversary of Zelda in 2011. Now, this was an amazing year because Nintendo went all out celebrating it. There were game releases, merchandise, a symphony, and even the release of Hyrule Historia.
Wait, was that 2011?
Which was published. Yes, this was 2011.
Oh
2011.
my god, what in the world?
So would you love to see
Came with a
Nintendo...
soundtrack.
Yeah. Would you love to see Nintendo celebrating the 35th anniversary like that next year?
Please?
Lego Zelda. I'm calling it. Lego Zelda sets are coming out next year.
Oh,
Anyway,
I would buy every single one of those. Please don't enable me. I have no money.
So then 2011 was also the release of Skyward Sword. So this was the big game of that year, and it brought something new to the Zelda franchise, which was full motion control. So for the first time, players were able to feel like Link, swinging their sword as they swung their Wii Motion Plus around. But the motion controls were a little controversial. So I want to ask you guys, did you like the motion controls, and did they enhance your overall experience of the game?
I'm someone who would fight Twilight Princess on Wii. I love the motion controls for that. And they weren't bad for Skyward Sword, I'm not gonna lie. But I felt it was... every enemy became a waggle puzzle that I just didn't want to deal with. And so it was like, I want to kill things. Easy.
They went, I think, too
The
hard.
whip mechanic with it was really fun. Like when you're running and you get to do that with it.
And bowling with bombs.
Yeah, no, that was pretty cool.
I think the motion controls were one thing that I think people had different opinions on, because I think some people, look, to be honest, played it in a way that kept making them have to reset the motion controls. Because, like Wii Sports or anything else, some people play like this and some people play like that. And that's something that, with Skyward Sword, it would mean that they were constantly just out of sync and they'd have to redo the thing. So, it's tricky in that sense. But, I mean, look, Skyward Sword, the one thing I'd never want to see again is the way that they did the music and the harp. But
You're not wrong.
And I think Skyward Sword really speaks of the legacy of what Zelda games go through, but the Zelda community go through. Each of these games, when they come out, these are one of the greatest games of all time. This got 10 out of 10 out of 10. Every single person that played it, loved it. But because you're such the top pinnacle, after a few years, you're open to criticism because you're so well loved. A lot of nostalgia. And to be honest, people are still thinking about this game. People are still thinking about this game. You can't say that about many games 10, 15, 20 years later. So I think that says a lot about the legacy of Zelda games, is that they're open to criticism and people's opinions change on them over time.
there's a backlash cycle to Zelda games where, like, you're seeing it with Breath of the Wild at the moment. It's like we had a Twitter prompt recently that was like, tell us your Zelda hot takes, and all these people being like, I hated Breath of the Wild. Look, I love Breath of the Wild, but I feel like for the first year or so after its release, there were probably a lot of people who were feeling like, well, I didn't like Breath of the Wild, but there's such a huge consensus seemingly in the community. But then, now they have a chance to, to see it from their perspective, because I think Zelda series means different things to different people. Like, there are people who started with games like Twilight Princess, and and when they think Zelda, they think, what kind of cool themed dungeons are we going to get with this game? And then they play Breath of the Wild and they're like, where are they? You know? Whereas you get people who, they really like the Breath of the Wild style, they like the style of the original Legend of Zelda, so they play Skyward Sword and they get mad and they go, it's so linear, I don't get the chance to really truly explore. And, you know, it's interesting to see that go back and forth in the community.
Yeah, Skyward.
What a cycle it is with Wind Waker when that came out. It was the exact opposite. I knew people, and I was one of them. Oh, I kind of like the game, but everyone was, so hard on it. You couldn't get your voice out and say, "Hey guys, this actually looks really good." And it's the opposite with Breath of the Wild. So many people were loving it that a few people were finding it difficult to come out and go, "Look, I've got a bit of a problem with it. It hasn't got dungeons." And now that spreads out, and everyone's got the chance to voice their opinion.
Skyward Sword was advertised as the first Zelda game in the timeline. So it's the very beginning where everything all began. Now, some of you guys have said that you're timeline theorists. So what were your thoughts when Nintendo announced that?
It's interesting because, look, it's exciting to have that origin story and to kind of see how it all forms. But what was always a little bit annoying for me was like, and then there's this 1,000 years ago part where there was another hero that is before him, and so it's not like the actual beginning; it's just the beginning that they want to talk to. So it's one of those of I wasn't expecting that, and at the same point I'm like, I feel like I've been told, like I've almost been told a lie. It's like this isn't where it all began. This is just where most of it began.
And it's happened before. This is where it all began. You read on the back, that's the beginning of the Zelda. And then this is where it all began. That's where Link gets his hat. So there's that little bit of fear that this is where it all began. Does it mean there's never 1,000 years before? They'll always find a way to go back another 1,000 years or do it again.
And I believe they immediately released like a manga that was set before the events of Skyward Sword.
Isn't it part of Hyrule Historia?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think the timeline is very fluid. So we were touched on the fact that Skyward Sword was very linear. So the next game that came out, A Link Between Worlds, was the first sign of a shift in the formula. A Link Between Worlds was a sequel to A Link to the Past and took us back to the same world, which was actually really cool to see like 20 years later, but you could actually complete it out of order, which was kind of revolutionary.
And not even out of order, there is no order.
Well, exactly, yes.
I think it plays to the notion of the original Link to the Past, because I believe there are, like, you can still do that in Link to the Past, right?
The
To a
dungeons
certain
are...
degree.
Yeah, so I think it plays deep into that as a spiritual successor, and I think it tracks very, very well. And with the new mechanics and with the new art style, honestly, it's definitely one of the better games that they have.
I was just going to say that I played A Link Between Worlds actually before I ever played A Link to the Past. So it was kind of cool getting to see what A Link Between Worlds was built on, like playing it in that order. I don't know, I just thought it was really, really neat just seeing like, oh, so this is where this came, so it was more of a, this is where it all came from. That was really cool. But I think as far as doing things out of order was kind of like they were testing it out for what they were going to do with Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
So when you went to Kakariko Village in A Link to the Past, it was like you were going back into time where it all started. That must have felt quite different.
It was really neat, just getting to experience like, huh, this is where it all came from. Neat. Okay.
And this was a paradigm shift that Eiji Aonuma had mentioned was going on, where for a long time he felt like you couldn't get lost. If the player ever felt lost, that was bad. And after a while, he started to realize, no, actually, it's okay to let the player, to trust the player to go find the story, to actually complete things on their own clock. And this was the first game that really sold that again. And when it became successful, he's like, he finally understood what the original Zeldas were about, and now I think that that's going to be the paradigm going forward.
And Skyward Sword got to the point where they'd mastered Zelda design. Even the world around getting into the dungeons was such a unique and interesting puzzle. And that's why everyone was so pumped for this game, that Twilight Princess, open, boring worlds. Skyward Sword, you were going to have to figure everything out. That came out, everyone loved it. Then a few years later, started to think about it. We want more open worlds. So this is Nintendo really testing, going back to that original feeling, and they nailed it. Absolutely nailed it.
All right, it is time to jump into Breath of the Wild, which we have already been talking about a bit, and many of us have said it is now our favorite Zelda game. So what do you think it did that made it so amazing?
It's fun because So I have no sense of direction, so I get lost in everything. When I'm playing Breath of the Wild, I feel like I can just run around and do things and feel like I have not wasted any time because there's always something to do, whether it's find one of 900 Koroks, add to the Hyrule Compendium, whether it's finding another shrine, whether it's just talking to somebody, doing a neat little side quest. That's what I love about it, is there's just so much you can do.
I think Breath of the Wild took everything that Zelda was known for, threw it out the window, and went the other direction. It goes into such a new direction that after Skyward Sword became kind of criticized for being heavy-handed, linear, and kind of a chore. Like, the opening of Skyward Sword takes like a good 4 or 5 hours, and in Breath of the Wild, you are literally thrown in and they just go, have fun, you're gonna die a lot, go nuts. And the fact that it kind of goes into a way going back to basics in a modern scenario is, I think, one of the most refreshing things that I have seen. I work in retail. Breath of the Wild's opening sequence was a demo for a while. One of the things I would do is constantly go through the opening sequence with people and, like, watching Link come up on the cliffside to see the world of Hyrule. I've gotten chills every time I watch that. I have seen it hundreds of times, and I have gotten chills every single time.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the biggest things that Breath of the Wild did, take gameplay out, take freedom, it's the actual, in the title, is the wild. And as you can see here, I've got the little campsite up the top of the Great Plateau, got the fire there. Just being in that world, I really love atmosphere. I love the environment of a game, and that's what Zelda's always done, is draw you into that world. And they've done it like no other game has. It'll take a long time for other games to really figure out just what they did. But I have fun just getting on my horse, picking a mountain, going riding, and maybe hunt for some food and have a fire and cook some food, and just being in that world.
Well, that's it. You say other games, and open world games weren't a new thing by the time Breath of the Wild came out. Things like Skyrim and The Witcher 3 were really highly acclaimed open world games. And yet, Breath of the Wild comes along and manages to put a fresh perspective and do it so bloody well.
Well, and it's interesting because there were other open world games, but there's no other open world games like Zelda, because there's always places that in open world games that you can't go yet, or like because there's an invisible wall, or you shouldn't go yet because every enemy is more higher level than you. And the other thing that I think is actually really good that, again, Breath of the Wild did that was really important was Shona and I live in the same house, and we played the games, simultaneously, and we would solve puzzles in different mechanics. Like there's this one shrine where you have to hold, you have to like shine something cold onto this, pillar to make the shrine appear, and I forgot about the water, the ice pillar thing, and Cryonis, yes. Shona, did that, and I'm like, oh, that's a clever solution. I just held up a snowball and had waited for the shadow to come across for it, and it was just cool to see, like, they didn't really prescribe solutions to you. They actually said, like, we've given you all the tools, have fun, and we don't care how you solve things, and that to me was a really artistic touch on Zelda.
I like how there's just so many ways to play the game. Even not just solving the puzzles, but like with the different equipment that you can use, the different clothing that you wear, and like the status buffs that they give. You can choose to make it as difficult as you want, or you can make it easier if you want.
Yeah. What about the equipment breaking?
Not a fan. I could go without losing half of my weapon loadout fighting a Lionel. I could do without that. Please don't do that next time.
Well, we'll talk about next time in just a moment.
You got to throw your equipment before it blew up. That's the one reason I love it, and the game wouldn't be the same without it.
Yeah, I think it's something that there's certain personality types that probably really struggle with the weapon breaking. There's certain personality types that just can't play it because the timer is stressful. There's people who, to an extent I'm guilty of, like, you play a Pokemon game or whatever and it's like ethers or whatever, I only have a few of them, I should never use them. And then I get to the end of the game and I've got like 15 piled up, and it's like, well, I should have used those at some point. But Breath of the Wild is the sort of game where, you do need to like save up your good stuff for a big enemy, and I find that satisfying, but there are other people who I'm sure find that stressful. So
Yep, it was frustrating at the start, but then as you grew stronger, yeah, you're like, right, I've got this good stuff. I'm going to use it wisely.
Well, and without having the weapons breaking, you wouldn't have that survival mechanic. Like, the first half of the game felt like you were just scavenging everything to survive. And if you had removed that, oh, well, I've got my really good weapon that I managed to find somewhere, I'll just use that everywhere, and therefore you would value it, but then you would not value, like, all the other treasure chests where you find, like, oh, here's a level 5 pickaxe or whatever it is. You're like, whoop-de-doo, toss it immediately. So I think it actually made you value everything you could find, and that was, without the breaking mechanic, you would never have that.
That's a fair
And I look
share.
forward to seeing what they do in the second one to improve it.
Let's talk about that now because there is a sequel, which is super exciting. So what would you like to see in it, and what would you like to see done differently?
I want to see all the Z-Link. That's what I want.
So word is that this is supposed to be even darker than Majora's Mask, which if that is true, I am so ready for this to go hardcore. I am so unbelievably ready for that. But one of the things I think I really want to see is, if you're gonna pull that, I want you to go harder on voice acting. Like, they added full voice acting in Breath of the Wild. I think they did a good job. It's only like 10% of that game. I want more. I want y'all to go harder. And on Dave's point, real quick, about the survival elements of the durability. Which is solid points. I think if we're going to continue that, you need to make your more valuable weapons and the more powerful weapons not that. Because then you feel like you've earned it to that point.
And I have a feeling they alluded to it in the reveal trailer, but I would really love for a deeper connection between Link and Zelda and have team survival. Like, you really need to keep Zelda alive, or Zelda on the other side of the coin helps to help keep Link alive. You have to survive together. Terrain's difficult. You have to help each other over the mountains. You have to get enough food for both of you. I think that would add a really, really interesting dynamic and create a lot more connection between the two characters.
Yeah, and with that, some fans are speculating that there might be either a multiplayer aspect or an aspect where you can switch between Link and Zelda and play as Zelda. Is that something you'd like to see?
I'm down.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, that is one of the more interesting mechanics of a game that we skipped over, Spirit Tracks, which I otherwise had a lot of problems with. But the fact that Zelda was your companion throughout the game was one of my favorite parts of Spirit Tracks.
And Zelda's got a haircut. She's ready to go. She's in survival mode. She's like, get rid of the long hair. Let's do it. Let's go
Oh,
into the
her
dungeon.
couture this year, even better.
Yeah.
We stand a fashion icon, is what I'm saying.
So unfortunately, we are out of time for this panel. So before we wrap up, does anyone have any final thoughts that they'd like to share?
We forgot a game.
No, we forgot four more games. Where are the
We
Forgot
CDI?
to.
Where's Link's crossbow training?
Where is the CDI?
I will say that we
goddammit?
have been charting
That's a
the
really good
history
game.
through. Yes, unfortunately, we've been charting the history through the major console releases. We do not have time to cover all of the spin-offs. Maybe that could be a separate panel one day, all the
Right.
Zelda spin-offs. Good idea.
If they give us 3 hours, we'll be able to cover all of your favorite Zelda games. But unfortunately, every year that we do a panel like this, the years get longer and more games get released. So it's going to be harder and harder to fit it all in an hour.
Not to mention the fact that we have done entire hour-long panels about specific games like Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild.
We
And
did
Majora's
skip over
Mask.
this one quickly. This is 2020, the video game. If you're having a tough year, give this one a go. That's exactly what we're doing.
Yikes, I hate it. Thanks, Kalum.
So I guess just to say that Zelda Universe is a long-running website. We have a Facebook, a Twitter, a YouTube, etc. So look us up, zeldauniverse.net. And as we said, we do have other panels covering things like just Breath of the Wild in depth that you can find on our YouTube channel if you liked this panel. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for watching, and here's to another 35 years of Zelda, or even more. Goodbye.
Cheers.